So you talked about non-modifiable and modifiable risk factors, and we went through obesity and diabetes, which are also linked. What else? What else is modifiable?
Hypertension. So high blood pressure. About 50% of adults today have hypertension. We're starting to see pre-hypertension in adolescents as well.
Oh, good.
But one of the seminal studies in the field of dementia prevention is it's known as the SPRINT Mind trial, which found that when people with hypertension were aggressively treated via pharmacological means for their hypertension, they saw a dramatic risk reduction for the development of cognitive impairment, mild cognitive impairment, in fact, which is considered like a prodrome of dementia, a form of pre-dementia, if you will. But we know that, lifestyle modification, dietary exercise, for example, all are, as effective as drugs. And when you have hypertension, essentially the blood vessels that are supplying blood, nutrients, oxygen to the brain are essentially damaged. And so, hypertension is incredibly damaging to the brain.
Okay. You said there were 12.
Yeah.
I think can we go through all of them?
We can go through, I mean, so those are the ones that I think that are most relevant to diet. But I think it's important at this, juncture to state that nutrition is not the only variable here. So I'll never know what caused my mom's dementia, unfortunately, although it's an investigation that's going to continue on through the rest of my life. But, nutrition is one slice of the pie. And so among the modifiable risk factors, you have, non-nutrition related risk factors, such as exposure to excessive air pollution on a chronic basis, which as of the 2020 Lancet Commission on Dementia was finally acknowledged as being a risk factor for the development of dementia. We've seen studies run in, for example, Mexico City, where they've seen pathological changes that are associated with Alzheimer's disease in the cadavers of adolescents and children. People who have died in Mexico City, who have been exposed over the course of their lives to, excessive levels of air pollution, like fine particulate matter, PM 2.5, for example, that they see an undue aggregate of, amyloid beta, for example, which is the protein that forms the plaques that, is one of the defining characteristics.
Is that an inflammatory consequence too, or does anybody know?
Yes.
It is?
Yeah. There's an inflammatory consequence. There's a cardiovascular consequence to being exposed to air pollution. With regard to your cardiovascular system, we know that what's good for the heart is good for the brain. And conversely, what's bad for the heart is bad for the brain. And so air pollution, plays a major role. An area that I think is incredibly exciting, also very scary, but ultimately empowering is, looking at certain environmental pollutants, like certain industrial solvents. For example, there's a compound that there's another fantastic neurologist who has become a friend and colleague, and I think his work is incredibly important. His name is Ray Dorsey, Dr. Ray Dorsey. He's a University of Rochester neurologist who has done a lot of work exposing the link between exposure to certain chemical solvents that are still widely being used in the United States, like trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene, and the etiology of Parkinson's disease and related conditions like Lewy body dementia, which is the condition that my mom suffered from. And so we know that, what we breathe, what we eat, these are all having an impact on our health. But now the evidence is really starting to emerge that, that the brain is not, does not sit in this privileged ivory tower where it's immune somehow to, what it is that we're eating and the compounds that we're, inhaling. The brain sits directly downwind of, a lot of the insults that are being waged by modern life, modern living. The trappings of modern society come at a cost, and we're starting to see that they now are likely having an impingement in our collective brain health. So, one of these compounds, trichloroethylene, which I just referenced, is still being used to spot clean in dry cleaning applications. And it's an incredibly volatile compound. It readily evaporates. It easily, infiltrates groundwater. And obviously, occupational exposure to these compounds is really bad. But there have been a small handful of epidemiologic studies that show that exposure to a compound like TCE, for example, is associated with a 500% increased risk of the development of Parkinson's disease. This is a compound that was used medically up until the 70s. It was used with, to decaffeinate coffee. It was used as an anesthetic for pregnant women. It's still being used as a metal degreaser. And again, it's used to spot clean in dry cleaning applications.
Now I'm skeptical of all my suits.
Yeah, well, you definitely want to not dry clean, or at least make sure that the dry cleaner that you're using is a quote-unquote green dry cleaner, because I think they'll be less likely to be using these kinds of compounds. But it's really scary stuff. My mom was somebody who worked in the garment industry in New York City. And so, she likely was exposed to these kinds of compounds on a regular basis. Certain herbicides and pesticides we know are, occupationally linked to these kinds of conditions like Parkinson's disease. We breathe them in through our nose, right? They don't undergo the same degree of detoxification as an ingested compound. They can very easily bypass the blood-brain barrier. They access the olfactory bulb. Actually, a decline in sense of smell is one of the earliest features of a preclinical feature of cognitive decline, dementia, and even Parkinsonism. And so, as far as these conditions are, these compounds are in our environment, I think that's, on the one hand, it's very scary, but it's also empowering. The more awareness that we can have about reducing our exposure to these compounds, I think it's crucially important. So that's another of the modifiable risk.
Yeah, that's on the toxic exposure side.
Yeah, which I think is incredibly important. My second book, The Genius Life, was really, looked at that. Or
how much of an overlap do you think there is between the dietary risk and the toxic exposure risk? Because obviously, well, and we'll get into this after we're done this section of the conversation, but obviously there's the carbohydrate, diabetes, obesity link, but then there's food toxicity link too.
Yeah.
Because lots of things that we think are edible would rather not be eaten, and they have, I've known for years that the typical plant, people are worried about the pesticides that are on plants, and fair enough, but they're not nearly as worried about the pesticides that are in plants, and there are plenty of them because, plants don't like being eaten by bugs, and most of them aren't that happy about being eaten by us either. And so they have got very potent chemical defenses, and they're not trivial. And I've wondered, because of my experiences with diet, I lost a lot of weight because of the diet that I'm on, and I kept it off, and that's quite the bloody miracle, that's for sure. It's really something to, I weigh what I weighed when I was in my 20s. That's really something when you're 62. It's like, what the hell? Who knew that was possible? And I have about the same bodily composition that I did when I was in my 20s. And some of that's obviously from not eating carbohydrates, but there are other improvements that I've experienced that have made me wonder, I had psoriasis. It's gone. And some of the psoriasis patches had lasted, literally decades, and they're gone. And I think, I was obviously eating something that was causing that. Is that carbohydrate linked? Who the hell knows? But is it food toxicity linked or immunological, allergic? I don't know.
Well, I think that most people, and this is where the debate about the carnivore diet and all that, I think, becomes really interesting. A robust organism such as yourself should be able to consume some of these plant, quote-unquote, defense compounds and garner a degree of, additional strength in so doing, right? There's this notion of hormesis where, low doses of a certain stressor, or toxicant, if you will, might actually cause a response in the system that actually leads to an up-leveling of robustness, of vigor, of strength.
Pharmacon means something like a little bit of the poison that kills you cures you.
Yeah. And so that's where I think if you have a robust, for example, gut microbiome, I think that most people should be able to derive value from these kinds of compounds.
That's the theory. When you look at the average health state of the typical person, it makes you wonder, right? And I've wondered how far down the rabbit hole you have to go to get to the bottom, given how obese people are. And well, what I've seen as the consequences of a relatively radical dietary shift. So, well, that's obviously one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you today. Let's turn then. We went through quite a few of the modifiable risk factors. Let's turn from that, if that's okay, unless there's any others that you'd like to specifically highlight. We could turn to that, to what you found in relationship to diet and what you've been recommending. So are there other modifiable risk factors that you think are worth concentrating on? We went through diet and exposure to pollutants and toxicity. Anything else that's directly relevant?
Yeah, well, there's a newly identified risk factor, and that is hearing loss. And that's, again, newly identified. So all the verdict, all the research, the research that we need to make, clear recommendations, other than if you have hearing loss, a hearing aid actually is a potentially, can be a potential boon to health.
So it's actually the loss of the auditory input.
Yeah.
And not a correlation between the degeneration of the ear and the degeneration of the brain. Or maybe
Correct.
both.
No, I mean, I think insofar as we know that social isolation, which is
it
in fact another, you become more and more isolated, in your own world. And I think that's probably harmful. We know that depression.
Sure.
Depression is another one.
Uh-huh.
And these estimates are typically conservative. So I said at the onset about 40%, which was the number that was given, most recently in this 2020 Lancet Commission on dementia prevention. But I think it's very likely that the majority of cases, at least with regard to Alzheimer's disease, and likely also even these Parkinsonian conditions, which it's becoming increasingly clear that there's an environmental toxicant aspect to them. I think that the majority, and this is just my opinion based on my assessment of the literature, are likely preventable. We don't have all the data yet, but I think given what we do currently know, we don't have to sit idly on our hands. For example,